I'm sure we all recognize this man, this laughing ghost from the past. This is Donald Rumsfeld, and the sort of subtitle of this talk, if there is one, is How Do We Discover Unknown Unknowns? And it was Rumsfeld who famously made this idea popular in his February 12, 2002 Pentagon briefing. The notion that, the report, that just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. So there are known knowns, things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. To say this was an understatement at the time is an understatement in itself. There's also a fourth category, which he did not name, which I think is also pursuant to discussion, and particularly bedevils any organization, which is the unknown known. The things that we don't know, we know. And that is sort of the whole what knowledge management has been trying to crack for 20 years. And we'll get into some of that. But it's this question of unknown unknowns. How do we find the things that we don't know we're looking for? How do we search for things we don't know we're going to find, and we don't know the combination of people and resources that can help us find it? And this to me is important because whenever we talk about innovation or ideas, the real game changers, the real high value ideas are the ones that we are not searching for. Those are the ones that change our perceptions and change paradigms. So as an example of that, this is a molecule. This is a molecule called darapladib. It is a molecule that was discovered or put together. It's essentially an enzyme. It's designed, or basically what it does is inhibits the buildup of cholesterol plaques in arteries. And it was developed 20 years ago by Human Genome Sciences, which was bought 2 years ago by GlaxoSmithKline. And darapladib was going to be one of the great shining hopes of GlaxoSmithKline in its sort of drug pipeline. And it was designed, what it would do is it would inhibit this enzyme and would slowly stop the buildup of plaques. And so you could sort of see, you'd have healthier arteries out of it. And it went through clinical trials for years. And then in March, it was revealed that darapladib, after promising success, was a total failure. And not only was it a total failure, it was a stink bomb of a drug in the sense that it made your skin, feces, and urine smell, to the point where patients stopped taking it. So this ended up being a $3 billion write-off for GSK. I know some folks are working here at NBBJ are doing some work with them, so this gives you an idea of what they're up against. And what's interesting about darapladib, of course, pharma has all sorts of failures and classically huge failures. But what's interesting about darapladib is that it was going to be sort of also not just the great shining hope of GlaxoSmithKline, but also of what genomic medicine was going to do for us. It was an attempt to engineer serendipity out of drug research. It was an attempt to sit down and actually tease apart, the mysteries of the genome and map every single, sequence all of the DNA and map out every genetic disease onto every sort of chromosome, and we would have a map of how to actually fix the human body. This was the promise that William Hazeltine, the founder of Human Genome Sciences, made 15 years ago after we first sequenced the genome. And all about that has been wrong. The complexity of genomic science has been vastly underestimated. Instead, and partly because what we call junk DNA, the notion that 80% of our chromosomes is considered junk, actually there are network effects within network effects that activate various genes. And so this whole attempt to come down from above and explicitly lay out genetic medicine has been a failure. And I think this is sort of an interesting metaphor for research because they sat down with huge research staffs and went about in a very organized way, here's how we will cure it. And it didn't work. And it's an example of what, it reminds me of a metaphor of this. Does anyone identify what this is, this image? It's a tree farm in Germany. A tree farm is what James C. Scott, the Yale anthropologist, uses as an example of what he calls a legible environment in his famous book, Seeing Like a State. And he compares it against this. This is also a farm. This is a farm in Papua New Guinea that is a polycultural farm. So what looks like a clearing or nothing in particular to us is, of course, an incredibly elaborate system of overlapping root structures that shelter and supply water and food at various stages. And I use this because Scott uses this as an example of legible versus illegible systems. Legible systems are very orderly. They are structured, they are hierarchical. We can stand from above or beyond them and look at them, and the system makes sense to us. And we can intervene in it very easily. And that's what a tree farm is. A tree farm is an extremely scalable, effective solution until, of course, it contracts tree blight, and then your entire forest dies. It's also very brittle. Illegible systems are the ones that we have the most trouble with, I think, as designers or as people understanding, because these are systems that are very, very micro knowledge in scale. They are available and readable only to people who happen to be in them. They don't scale very well, and they're very difficult to understand at a higher level. But they're very powerful structures. I mean, It's interesting, in Scott's book and sort of the discussions around this, you can look at all sorts of various legible versus illegible systems. In Scott's book, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. He looks at attempts to build cities from scratch like Brasilia. He looks at Soviet collective farms and how they failed, where they removed farmers from their land and their understanding of soil, and then of course destroyed them, et cetera, et cetera. But for our circumstances, a legible system is closed versus the open system of illegible ones that take in new inputs. Companies versus cities, a classic example of legible versus illegible, where we have the hierarchy of the org chart versus these completely illegible buried social networks in cities that produce, as Jane Jacobs said, new work, and has led to this sort of flowering of interest in the productivity of cities. The cathedral versus the bazaar, that's of course a reference to the famous essay about open source software. Open source is a chaotic bazaar of overlapping interests where anyone can contribute versus the traditional cathedral design approach of very small teams that understand the intricacies of software, but there's only so many bodies. Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs, and that debate about how to interpret the city and design it. And to me, just the general trend of purpose versus generative. Legible organizations are focused in a single direction versus the sort of larger generativity of illegible ones. It's harder to shape them. But the problem with this is that essentially we're seeing a decreasing returns to complexity when it comes to legible organizations. So this is a chart from a very scary paper written by Joseph Tainter, who is most famous for his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. Tainter is also an anthropologist. He specializes in dead civilizations, which also should give you pause. And a couple of years ago, he got interested in patent research. So this is a graph showing that basically what we're seeing is what I was saying, a decline in returns to complexity. We're seeing a decreasing number of patents per inventor over the last 30 years and an increase in the average size of patenting teams. This is what happened at GlaxoSmithKline, and this is what's happening in innovation teams in general, is that we're throwing more stuff at the wall and less of it is sticking. Instead of innovation accelerating, we're actually seeing it getting worse. There's a great name for this, Eroom's law. It's Moore's law backwards. And when large organizations, instead of doubling in expertise, they're actually seeing these decreasing returns to scale. And it's not just in pharma research. This is out of their stuff. They saw it in drugs and chemicals, chemical processes. They also saw it in metallurgy, optics, all sorts of other fields where you just see long-term declines in the number of patents per inventor. Part of this, there's an interesting question of, when any field is new, it's very easy to generate a lot of patents. And then, of course, over time, you refine them. But I still think it's a very troubling piece of evidence to show that the sort of organizational structures that we've developed and our rational approach to innovation to build teams and build facilities and organize people in ways that we think will yield knowledge is actually sort of falling off. And this is the scariest one, showing basically patents to GDP ratios that we've seen in the last few years. A decade ago, we started to see collapses in terms of the amount of money that the returns that we're getting to the amount of money we're actually spending on R&D. And so as a contrast to this, what GSK did in its very sort of rational complex is a really interesting natural experiment that comes out of Paris-Jussieu, which is, of course, the largest medical research complex and scientific research complex in France. So Jussieu had a whole interesting experiment where between 1997 and 2012, I believe, 15 years, every lab, hundreds of labs in the entire complex, were picked up and moved at random because of asbestos removal. And so with very little warning and no control over where you would be going, your lab would be taken from its whole cluster of collaborators and dropped elsewhere at random in this campus. And a MIT professor named Christian Catalini went back and sourced all 55,000 papers that were written during that 15-year period and sat down with maps and interviews and figured out the location of every single lab to its collaborators in that time. And what he found is that rather than massively disrupting their research once these labs were removed, he found that each lab was 3 to 5 times more likely to do cross-disciplinary research with its new neighbors. It published 3 to 5 times as many papers in that span as it had previously, and they were more likely to be widely cited. They were producing better, more influential work. And to me, the interesting takeaway from this is that the administrators of Jussieu and we in general have no idea how to actually organize knowledge research. It turned out that randomness was actually the best strategy for increasing innovation for these teams. And so what does it say? How are we actually supposed to deal with this? And this is of course, a shot from Jussieu. The one unanswered question out of this is how much role did space play in their actual productivity of this? And Catalini, he basically went through raw data, so he doesn't actually know the design of the labs. But and we don't know if this beautiful innovative space, and I had some more slides, had anything to do with it. Although we do know from his research that that Allen's law and the Allen's curve still actually holds. The communication patterns between labs and their ability to collaborate was defined very, very closely by their actual proximity to each other. Once your lab was dropped next to somebody else into the complex, you suddenly started working with them. They had been there the entire time. They just had been a different wing of the complex. But until you have that face-to-face encounter and that very sort of tight communication range, nothing was going to happen. And so to me, this is very telling in the sense of, A, we don't know really how to plan out these teams. B, we do know that physical proximity matters more than ever. And in fact, work by my friend Ben Weber at MIT has shown that, that actual digital communication maps to the Allen's curve as well. You will not be emailing someone on the other side of the world unless you've really met them face to face. You are in fact more likely to be emailing or Slacking or whatever communication tool you want to use with someone who sits within 6 to 60 feet of you. All of those tools conform to that. And so, to me, the whole question is, comes down to the word serendipity, right? It was serendipitous that these labs were dropped in next to each other. And serendipity, of course, has played a major, major role in all sorts of scientific innovations. In fact, plays, I think, an everyday role in the discovery of ideas. We are constantly, unlocking this tacit information in our heads and trying to basically make it visible. And of course, the most famous example of serendipity is Alexander Fleming with penicillin in 1928, inventing the entire new field of antibiotics, probably the greatest invention of the 20th century. And that list of serendipitous inventions goes on. I mean, the Nike waffle sole, Kevlar, Teflon, huge swaths of medicine and chemistry, industrial chemistry, come out of totally serendipitous accidents. My favorite is the 3 major types of artificial sweeteners all came from lab accidents where the researchers then picked up their lab bench and stuck their fingers in their mouths. The original trial of saccharin is that apparently the scientist who found it took 10 grams of it to see if it would kill them. And instead they passed it right through and it was fine. And stuff goes on like this. IBM discovered a whole new class of polymers recently where they made a lab error and came back and found overnight that the pestle was stuck in the jar and had completely solidified. So this sort of goes on. And to me, what's interesting about serendipity in this is that we have really no way of quantifying it, right? We know that discovery plays a vital process in this, and we know that there's all sorts of illegible ways of actually doing discovery, but nothing in efficiency or productivity measures or any of those metrics allow us to actually acknowledge serendipity. And so, of course, the word comes from Horace Walpole. It's a fascinating, weird word, serendipity. Coined in 1754, vanished for 100 years until his letters were published. It wasn't until the 1930s that the word actually came into vogue to really start describing the discovery of new ideas. And so, what I'm using for is I'm staking my own claim on what serendipity means. A lot of people will tell you what serendipity is or isn't. These days, we use it really to refer to happy accidents. And it's the title of rom-coms with John Cusack and Kate Beckinsale. And my favorite is, what is it? It was on the cover of a Victoria's Secret catalog once, completely unexplained. I mean, I think most people just think of serendipity as a happy word. Well, I want to argue what it is. Serendipity is not magical. It has nothing to do with cosmos or fate or any of that. Serendipity is where good ideas come from. It is partly that process. I actually want to argue that that serendipity is really the sort of process through which tactile knowledge sort of fuses and produces something else. It is this tacit, I should say, this sort of tacit knowledge in our heads. It's so difficult to get out. Serendipity is the process where it actually fuses together new ideas, and it is absolutely necessary. I think. And this is part of my talk here, is that we have to tend towards sort of new organizational models, new space design models to encourage serendipity, because the formal way of designing how we work and designing organizations is producing these decreasing returns to scale. So how do we develop basically a new black box that we don't know, if we put elements into it, will it produce things on the other side that we have no idea we ever guessed? That is, to me, the challenge. And the question is, what are those black boxes? And so I'm going to talk about scale. I guess there are 4 black boxes that I think we can design serendipity at. You, the office, the city at the next scale up, and then I think the most interesting possibilities will be the networks, tying social networks on physical space, illuminating the ties between us and the context that we are producing all the time with our data exhaust. So we'll quickly go through all of these in turn. So serendipity, how does serendipity actually work? How do we mentally process it? That sort of eureka moment where, suddenly you stumble across an idea, whether it's, I forget the French researcher who discovered benzene by sitting in front of the fire and visualizing a snake eating its tail, which produced the actual chemical ring. How did that happen? We don't know. We just have anecdotes and just so stories. As far as I can tell, there's only really one psychologist who sat down and tried to actually map out the serendipity process. What does it look like as a mental model? His name's James Lawley. He's an Australian psychologist. And he's given a few presentations on this. And so this is his process. E is the unexpected event. And then here's sort of the walkthrough. The prepared mind, recognizing the potential, seizing that moment, amplifying it, and then sort of evaluating and going through the whole process. So the prepared mind, of course, refers to the famous Louis Pasteur quote, that the fields of observation, chance favors the observed mind, or only prepared mind, I should say. And so that's really our first question is what does a prepared mind look like? And I think one of the things, one of the problems that we've had in terms of thinking about the organization of knowledge work is that we think in terms of domains. It's always funny to me when I think of someone who says they're multidisciplinary. Well, that means you're thinking in terms of disciplines, right? We're implicitly putting ourselves in a silo when we talk about multidisciplinary work. So I was just at Cambridge last weekend interviewing Joey Ito, who runs the MIT Media Lab, who has a great word that I like saying he's anti-disciplinary. And he basically wants to abolish disciplines because disciplines just encourage you to think in your particular silo and wage politics. So is there a way to actually to prepare ourselves to actually start internalizing, to look for bridges between fields, to actually start thinking in metaphors? Lawley describes it as that we have this trap of domain specificity, and he likes to think about model fertility. Instead of thinking about specializing in each domain, can we build models of approaching and understanding the world that we can then port to various fields? And I think this is interesting because this is, I think, what IDEO has done as a design firm that they're so famous for. I mean, IDEO exploits serendipity. There's all sorts of papers written about their serendipity process. But that's because as a firm, IDEO simply has experts in each domain, whether it's healthcare or hard technology and everything else, and they simply take experts from one domain and apply them to another. They've built these really lush models, and so it allows them to take ideas from medicine and transport it over to technology and vice versa. It's basically domain brokerage, and it works very, very well for them, obviously. So that's sort of one way. How do we build bridges, mentally for that sort of domain? The second, of course, is the unexpected event. Something happens and it triggers something in you. Classically, there's a line that the true sound of scientific discovery is not eureka. It's that data is interesting, or what happened here? The stroke of anomalous data that triggers some sort of understanding that something has gone awry, and is that a promising mistake? And so recognizing these moments of mistake, these breaks in actual sort of processes, is really where serendipity happens. And from there, it's the potential of this. Is this a fertile mistake? Is this a fertile opportunity? Is it potentially serendipitous? And this is sort of a question, this is, I think, the hard part in developing it mentally. In talking to Joey Ito about it, he describes it as having a sort of intuition about intuition, meta-intuition, as he calls it. And it's something that he thinks that in himself, at least, it's something that gets better over time. Is when we're younger, we seem to have various mental domains. Obviously, mathematicians, poets. There's a whole field, I think, of creativity that's particularly good when you're young. And he was arguing that it's one of the habits of middle age that he's found is you start to have a better understanding about a pattern recognition ability about what is a sort of promising mistake. I don't know if I can abstract that from his mind here, what that's going to mean, but we do need to sort of have a better understanding, right, of what this sort of pattern recognition can be. And from there, it goes into seizing the moment. And I think this is where sort of organizational efforts get into play. Once you have this anomalous data and you have this opportunity, can you mobilize resources in the organization to actually pursue it? Can you find the right collaborators to get going on it? And this is sort of the whole discussion about, failure is a hot topic right now. I agree with the whole notion that that crowing about your failures and being free about that you failed really just shows that you have the privilege of failure and not having it being a career-ending mistake. But this is something I think within the field of an organization that actually matters here. Do you have the latitude to chase what could be a total failure, what could be a hair through the field kind of thing? And that is something that organizations do terrible about because, of course, we have P&L statements and we have metrics to chase. How do we place more bets? How do we actually iterate more quickly and actually allow people to follow these pursuits? That is a challenge for organizations. And then I think the final step of this is amplifying the effects. And so in Ito's case, this is where we start to have the bridge between you, the individual, and those sort of larger networks. How do you actually go out on Twitter, on social media, through the organization to actually start finding collaborators? How do you start bridging the gaps between your discovery and the people who can actually help find you? And can we build better systems that can connect you? Quite possibly, and I think quite necessarily, to people you don't know you're looking for. The person you probably need to help you with your serendipitous idea is someone that you're not immediately going to seek out. And that's going to be, I think, the challenge of the sort of next levels here. So step 2 is the office. And when it comes to legible versus illegible environments, Robert Probst in 1964, when he was doing the Action Office 2, he was trying to design an illegible office environment that was highly customizable, that would allow people to really control their work environment and allow you to actually change it on the fly. And of course, what do? We designed it for maximum legibility here. Really the complete inverse of his actual intentions there. And so, to me, it's interesting because, of course, this was meant to be a knowledge work environment, right, where you'd be able to allow to customize your environment and control who you were speaking to. And instead, we built it for maximum efficiency and built it for maximum control and hierarchical study. That's what happens. Really, really the environment of our time. But at the same time that we were building the cubicles, right, there were other modes of organizing knowledge work that persisted and have really come back to the fore. So Bell Labs, the 1940s, probably the most productive research environment that ever existed, right? We got the laser, we got radar, we got satellites out of it, all because Bell, AT&T, Bell Labs, really sort of organized their teams in multidisciplinary units where you had metallurgists with theoretical physicists in close quarters, in hallways that forced you to interact. You couldn't get to your office without going through the cafeteria. All these sorts of very sort of ad hoc ways of actually encouraging interactions between staff. What's sad to me is the fact that we're still telling just so stories like that about Pixar, in their bathrooms, when Bell Labs was doing this 70 years ago. And then, of course, the other great example that comes out of this is MIT's Building 20, which is famously sort of the serendipity womb there, the womb of innovation at MIT, where they just dumped the leftover research groups in the 1940s. I mean, that's where Chomsky ended up with his linguistics group. They actually ended up doing radar research. I mean, literally, if they had nowhere else to put you in departments, they dumped you here into this wood structure that was always meant to be temporary, and which allowed the research teams to really customize their environment, right? Because they felt no vested interest in preserving the building. People could drill holes through the walls and do whatever they wanted. And so, famously, and also the other interesting thing about it was it was a highly illegible environment in the sense that one of its great advantages, as it turned out, was that the office numbering scheme was so terrible and confusing that people would just get lost wandering the hallways. And that's how actually some of the most interesting conversations happened. They created a very sort of opaque environment that led to a flowering of interesting combinations. So, so this is, of course, was Building 20 that inspired, Frank Duffy developed the schema, of course, originally, but it was Building 20 that inspired Stuart Brand to take it and expand upon it in his book, How Buildings Learn. And I think what's interesting for a room particularly full of office designers is that, the level of stuff in this diagram has accelerated much faster. If we're thinking about this as sort of changing timescales of fluidity, the stuff part, of course, is accelerated almost to like, a blur at light speed, because this is, of course, the part that has been accelerated by digital technologies the most, and also accelerated by changing work teams, changing strategies, the fact that we're supposed to pivot on a daily basis. I think my wife's startup in New York is supposed to have a pivot meeting as soon as she wakes up. They're probably going to change the whole model. So how do we keep up with this stuff? How do we actually design environments that can change at the pace of the actual business itself? This, to me, is, as a non-practitioner, the interesting question, because as all of you, and I know this from speaking to MBBJ earlier this year and speaking just now, is that the whole practice of office design, as far as I can tell, is set up to do massive amounts of iteration to understand the optimal layout of a company for the one moment in time where you're going to install that office, and then maybe you come back 5 years later and do site studies and figure out how that's changed. When we know that work is changing all the time, and in fact should probably be changing faster in combinations we don't even know. So how do we actually keep up with that cycle? Well, the classic strategy, what they did at Stata at MIT, where I was at last weekend, which was built by Frank Gehry on top of what was Building 20. There they tried to formalize, the various techniques that Building 20 did informally. There they, put on whiteboards and made it very easy and had all sorts of alcoves where you could sit and talk. Some people like it. Stuart Brand famously called it an abortion, which tells you what he thought of it. I know graduates who think it's fussy and overdetermined. But what's interesting there about the parallels now is, of course, Gehry is back in the game of office design doing one for Facebook. And I think it's particularly telling and interesting that basically Zuckerberg told Gehry in no uncertain terms, I don't want you to really do a building for me or no interiors. They're just building one giant mile-long room and a quarter-mile wide, a single flat plane where they can put in 3,000 engineers with all of their desks on casters. And this is sort of going to be Zuckerberg's gambit, that level of stuff, is that basically they want to make this entire space as reconfigurable as possible and have as many engineering teams collide outside of their actual bounds. The whole point is to sidelines Gehry's contributions, which I wonder what he actually thinks about this. I've tried talking to him about it, and all he would say diplomatically is that Mark had a very, very strong vision when they met, to say the least. And that really Mark just wanted the sort of open, airy feel of Gehry's own office. So basically he's designed to do his own office at scale and then get out of the way. But I think this is interesting because this comes, again, this sort of like reminds me in a way of Paris Jussieu in a way, is that basically this represents sort of a failure of the office design profession, is that Zuckerberg doesn't actually believe that Gehry can produce any value for his company. And he also believes, and I think this is the more interesting about Silicon Valley, or where this is going, is that the Valley companies, the technology companies, are realizing that there are informal networks inside the company that are unlocking all sorts of value for them that they can't formally manage. Right? They're trying to figure out ways to get their employees to work across disciplines, and they can't dictate those ahead of time. And when I talk to Google, for example, I mean, they'll tell you that, that Gmail and Street View and some of their core stuff from 10 years ago really came from engineers who were chatting over lunch outside their respective divisions, that actually were part of unplanned collaborations. And in fact, Google has taken to all this sort of social engineering to encourage their employees to stay there to actually create these collaborations. So it's not just about keeping them at their desk 24 hours in the name of productivity. It's that Google actually started a beekeeping club so that engineers who are interested in beekeeping might meet each other and actually have discussions about unrelated subjects. So I think it's interesting. They're building this parallel informal management structure that they can't quite control. And of course, this has become the vogue. Serendipity is quite the Silicon Valley buzzword. I mean, engineering serendipity is a phrase that I did not make up. It came out of South by Southwest in 2012, was the name of a panel there. Joey Ito was on a panel at 2013 South by called The New Serendipity. And it's been used over and over. And this is, of course, an MBBJ design. This is the Samsung campus under construction right now in Silicon Valley. And for a piece I wrote for Harvard Business Review that came out this fall, I talked to one of their VPs of their semiconductor division. And as he told me, he's like, innovation is not something that happens at your desk. It requires talking to people. It requires these collisions. And the one question he could not answer when I asked him is, how do you know this? How? What is the data? Can you quantify this? Can you tell me this? And it's interesting because we've internalized it, but we don't really know why. And I do think it's imperative that we do figure out if this is actually true, or else we risk that the serendipitous office will be yet another fad in the same way that the Action Office 2 was and that the Open Plan Office was. We need to basically quantify the results. And it's interesting because, of course, the tech companies, they're making a big show of it in general, but they don't really believe it, I think. So this is Sam Lessin. Until recently, he was a Facebook executive. This is him playing beer pong now that he's a civilian. And he recently gave an interview. His wife runs a website out of Silicon Valley called The Information. And he talked about the time, like now that he's actually commuting across San Francisco, working in the city, he really, really misses the monoculture, the cult that was Facebook, and wants back in. At Facebook, my meetings, my gym, and food were all within a 1 or 2 minute walk. Now they're a few minutes a ride away from where I'm working. Food requires leaving the building. These bits of friction add up quickly. To me, that's both really sad and indicative. It's interesting because if you go to Facebook and Google right now, you understand very quickly that they're building, at the Googleplex and Facebook, they're building mini cities. They're actually using urban layouts. They understand the implicit energies of the city, and we'll talk about this next, that cities are, of course, the greatest serendipity environments of all. And so they're trying to actually design these environments that are more walkable, that allow all these sort of spillover. It's just that their employees are also used to having every need provided for them and are also really used to only dealing with each other. And I think this is, if you have spent much time in San Francisco, is one of the whole big tensions about it. Twitter has made a big show about moving back to the city and got various tax breaks to relocate within San Francisco. Well, now they're building a sky bridge, the new building that they have, so their employees never have to go outside the habit trail that they built for them. That really sort of misses the point about relocating to cities. But there are some other sort of interesting examples where you see the scale starting to change, where you're starting to see the boundaries between organizations break down in the name of idea sharing. So anyone who's spent much time reading corporate management literature has heard about ecosystem theory, right? The notion that the functional boundaries of the enterprise are not a single company, is that the enterprise spans multiple companies, partners, vendors, suppliers, customers, all of this in these great ecosystem chains. This to me is interesting because A, it's true. I mean, we see processes go across that. But B, we never really work this way, right? In a physical environment, companies do not really share office space all that often. They certainly do not create these interesting overflows, these sort of porous membranes through which people can pass in and out. And there's a few interesting weak signals that this is starting to happen. This is one of them. This is called Grid 70. It's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's an experiment where 6 multi-billion-dollar companies have moved their creative teams into. And they're interesting companies because they're not tech companies. They're not all that innovative, really. They're just local billionaire giants. So one is Steelcase, as you would imagine, would be interested in this. But the others are Wolverine Sporting Goods, which is the shoe company that makes Hush Puppies and Topsiders. One is a grocery store chain named Meijer. One is Amway, the famous multi-level marketer, and another is a healthcare company. And so they've moved in, the design teams of Wolverine are in there, the new business development teams of Amway and others are in there. And it's very explicitly designed that these teams will share information with each other. This is a photo of their Skunk Works room, which is a contradiction in terms because the dictates of the Skunk Work room is that if you have a meeting in there, everyone is entitled to drop in and comment on your actual meeting. In fact, they're encouraged to do so. This has not yet yielded some massive success. This isn't like crowdsourcing, which produced the Swiffer, the billion-dollar product. But it is interesting because what it does is it's allowing these teams to learn. It raises sorts of interesting questions to me about who we should be working with. Because of course, traditionally, like we work with colleagues, people who get paychecks from the same employer, and we work in functional units, right? HR next to sales and payroll, marketing and sales and design teams, et cetera, et cetera. And here what they did was they took all sort of related peers from different organizations and put them in the same physical space, gambling that they would learn faster from each other by sharing information within their peer group and their community of practice than they would with their nominal colleagues. And there's signs of that actually happening. They are in fact learning faster, and they are having sort of increased information flow across the organizations. And that's because they're working in very close proximity. What you would be interested in knowing in particular is it's a terribly designed space. It's sort of a retrofitted building on multiple floors, which as we know from spatial designs is it basically breaks up communication flows. So when I was there, I was like, wow, this is a really fascinating experiment. You basically did it in the worst possible way, I mean, in terms of the way you arranged it. So we'll see other people who are doing it. But AT&T is trying this as well, and I think they've gotten even more tangible success. So they've created a whole sort of global network of R&D centers called the Foundry. This is their one in Palo Alto. And the whole point of the Foundry is they take select AT&T engineers and they invite in partner teams, so Ericsson, Cisco, big equipment manufacturers, and then also selected startups. And they don't invest in them. It's not an accelerator incubator, but it's a notion of come work with us, next to us, and let's see how we can work together and what ideas we can share with each other. And so it's a sort of hands-on sort of work experience there. And it was one of these companies, it was called Intucell, that allowed AT&T to actually fix the problem it had in New York and San Francisco, where it was almost impossible, if you remember 4 or 5 years ago, to actually make a phone call on an AT&T iPhone in New York. It simply kept falling apart. Intucell's technology was what allowed them to actually improve the call drop problem and fix that. And eventually Cisco bought it for $475 million. So it was that combination of accessibility and improvement by working hands-on together. And the Foundry is designed to be, again, this sort of more permeable environment, right? They also have sort of a hand-picked list of local VIPs who are allowed to work out of this design environment, which was designed by Stanford's D School. So it is a sort of creme de la creme of Silicon Valley style inspired open design. But organizationally, I think, is what makes it more interesting. And then, of course, we're seeing, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the rise of co-working. I think co-working is a sort of very interesting trend because the whole point of co-working is to actually take the office typology but start removing the sort of cultural norms from an office. This notion that you can work side by side with people and have these sort of interesting collisions and ideas, but you're not bound to actually take meetings with them. It allows you to have all the benefits of proximity and co-location without being stuck in synchrony, where you have to be there at a certain time, and being stuck in a certain organization. And so, we've seen, and of course, London is huge with this. Google campus has been a really interesting example of this. But, WeWork is the first that's trying to expand this internationally. And they don't sell themselves as a space solution. You're not buying a desk at WeWork because you need a desk. You are paying for access to their community of entrepreneurs. And so I think we're going to see over time, we're going to start to see co-working start to become more formalized and appeal to different industries. Imagine a co-working chain crossed with Grid 70 where you want to work in a fertile environment full of, actually sort of, they are doing some drug pharma research actually at WeWork in New York. So you can imagine, in various creative fields, various scientific fields, these sort of open-ended, community-based forms of the office, which then inevitably leads us to the city as sort of the next step of this. So, cities are special, and this is what to me is interesting about it. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Jeffrey West and Luis Betancourt, the Santa Fe Institute physicists, who made a big splash 5 years ago, and they basically argued that cities represent something very different than life forms, that cities get better as they get bigger. And so they graphed out all this data and all this infrastructure and everything else, and they found out that yes, as cities get larger, assuming a lot of things actually, assuming they have good transportation networks and good walkability, assuming they have high performance characteristics, you actually see that they gain 15% as they double in size. And that applies to wages, super creatives, all these sorts of things. And they also found that cities are not bound by biological growth either. We are all on the left side here. We all scale sublinearly. We are born, we mature, we plateau, and we die. And that's true for companies as well, right? With the exception of a handful of breweries that have lasted for more than 1,000 years, nearly all companies die within a century. Beer is immortal. We have learned that. And I think a few copper concerns in Sweden. But they are all mortal things. Cities, of course, are very different. They're superlinear, right? They can theoretically grow without limit and last for as long as they, last forever in theory. Assuming, of course, you can continue to fix your plumbing, fix your sanitation, make it through these step changes. They become more resource intensive, but also more efficient over time. And so the question is, what makes a city? Why is the city so special? Why does it have that performance characteristic versus this one? And so Betancourt wrote an essay last year, which I found particularly provocative, because the whole metaphor of what a city is something that has bedeviled architects and urban design forever. It was Le Corbusier who said it was a machine. Patrick Geddes famously argued that cities are biological and that we should be gardeners. Jaime Lerner, he uses urban acupuncture as his sort of metaphor that, we are doctors working on a very fragile patient. But Betancourt used a perfectly good science metaphor, which is that what cities are, what makes them special, is that they are social networks compressed in space and time. And the denser you can compress it, and the more matter you can compress into that very small space, the hotter it gets. Cities are stars or suns, and that they produce light and heat in the form of all of those metrics they mapped: wages, super creatives, all these good and bad things. And so to me it's interesting because I would argue, extending the serendipity argument further, that fusion of cities is serendipity. It allows us to find people in new environments and new combinations all the time. The reason, as Jane Jacobs, when she described the whole process of new work forming in cities and the economy of cities, was a serendipity process where where you develop an idea and then you meet someone who has the other half of the idea that you're looking for, and now you're setting up shop and you're expanding the whole thing. A rather unscientific way of explaining it, but this is the sort of hidden process. Is there a way to actually see how serendipity happens? And this is what we're actually going to start talking about next week at Santa Fe when I'm going out there for a workshop on how do we understand how the process of serendipity happens. Betancourt would love to see nothing more than something like psychohistory, if those of you who read Isaac Asimov, where literally he wants to build a model that the only way to really understand it would be to actually see the summation of everyone's life choices, to see how serendipity intervenes in your life at every single step and how all these possibilities unfold to you. I mean, an admirable goal, but that truly is psychohistory. But what I think is interesting is we can still sort of see how this fusion process happens, and we can see it particularly in informal settlements, right? If you really want to see where urban reactions happen the most, go to places like Dharavi. And so this is part of the research I'm doing now at my think tank, at looking at what we can learn from informal settlements. So here, this is some work done by the Mumbai-based design collective CRIT. This is from their 2010 Audi Urban Future Initiative award submission called Being Nicely Messy, which was their study of Dharavi. And they sort of look at what they call the logic of the city is the blur, right? Cities have this sort of intensity of use of space that doesn't happen anywhere else. And it's most intensive in the slums and favelas and other sorts of informal communities where you see people occupying the street and occupying all these sorts of spaces and massively increasing the amount of entrepreneurial energies that are present. Of course, because they are resource deprived. And so you sort of see this blur between the public and the private, this sort of maximization of energy. And you sort of see all these sort of typologies which we've engineered out of our cities, right? You see, homes being built on top of factories. I think Dharavi, I think India famously, there's a statistic where 80% of India's exports are designed by firms of 20 people or fewer. So therefore you see this sort of micro-manufacturing typologies. And it's endlessly fascinating to me that when we talk about the rise of the sharing economy or the maker culture, all of that, this is what slums have always done, right? The sharing economy is essentially a slum economy. It's everything you own is an asset to be bought, sold, traded, or rented. That's what's happening in Dharavi all the time. And the maker culture, we're all going to prototype our using 3D printers in our garages. That's what's happening here, only it's actual real manufacturing. It's an intensity of use here that produces, what they call the blur, and what they also call, that increases a city's transactional capacities, right? It allows this sort of incredible amount of mixed uses that happens in cities. And so what they reach at in terms of a sort of urban design typology, and I find this graphic fascinating, is that they argue that at one end you have maximum resources and no blur. You end up with the Ambani apartment tower, the city of towers where no one mixes on the street. And at the other end, you have maximum transactional capacities where everyone is an entrepreneur and everyone is hustling all the time, and you have no resources. And that truly, at the far end, is the slum, is basically a hopeless slum. And then they identified the ideal optimum, the cross, that degree of blur, is what they call old labor housing, which to me is interesting because, again, we come back to Jane Jacobs and her famous dictum that new ideas require old buildings, and we end up with building 20. We end up with these environments that are really optimized to increase diverse interactions between strangers, diverse interactions between ideas, the right kind of environment for these ideas. And so it becomes a question of how do we design them, and how do we activate them in the cities we have. So this is an example of, I think, there's some really interesting sort of weak signals and projects doing this. Is anyone familiar with Renew Newcastle? They're very interesting. Marcus should get more press. This is a project done by Marcus Westbury. He's an arts organizer in Newcastle, Australia. Newcastle is, I forget the British compare. It's sort of the Cleveland of Australia in that sense. It's not as hopeless as Detroit, but it was a sort of decaying Rust Belt town of Australia. And the urban core, typically had sort of been boarded up. And when Westbury moved back in 2008 to his hometown to help them figure out what to do about it, he discovered that essentially the landlords had no real interest in taking their spaces and making it available to entrepreneurs and artists. They were more than content to just let their buildings sit there and basically collect the tax advantages without having any renters. And so it was Westbury who figured out, using his background as an arts festival organizer, to create a sort of new permit system and all this sort of lightweight regulation that would allow people to have very, very temporary uses of the space. So rather than having to sign leases or buy buildings or do any of the sort of heavy infrastructural lifting, he basically created a sort of new middleware which would allow them to activate all this space. And so now there's more than 100 projects and a whole, all these sort of people who are now mingling in downtown Newcastle. And so to me, this is a sort of interesting example of how do you engineer serendipity at an urban level? Well, we could start actually by increasing the heterogeneity of our buildings, right? Just as a larger aside, I think it's fascinating to me, as someone who does not design office space, that we know from studies from people like AECOM and Frank Duffy, that office buildings reach peak utilization like what, 40%, 42%? We've taken all of our cities and we've taken the most valuable real estate and filled them with buildings that are empty. And that was before, of course, we started having hyper real estate inflation when it comes to residential prices. How do we actually start activating the buildings we have? How do we increase the intensity of usage in the city? And so this, to me, speaks to the notion that we need to extend the street into the building. We need to do more cross-company working, like I was describing, and we need to do more projects like this that allow us to see space and activate it in various ways. And so, this is happening in cities around the world. 3 Spaces here in London, they won the FT City Urban Ingenuity Award for what they do, where they take over buildings with temporary leases and lease it out to artists. And suddenly, an empty building is now filled with this great diverse mix of various, artisans and artists. In New York, we're doing Made in Lower East Side. We have a very similar problem to Renew Newcastle, but it's the price of success. You're seeing landlords all across Lower East Side and East Village who are just waiting for Urban Outfitters or Armani to take over their lease for 20 years. So why should they rent out their empty storefronts to you? Well, Made in Lower East Side is trying to work with these landlords to actually allow temporary spaces. So they're designing a typology they call the transformer, which allows you to stick it into a small storefront and turn it into any number of uses to actually increase, again, the intensity of the streetscape. This is what tactical urbanism is doing, right? This is the whole parklet notion where you take a parking space and turn it into a park for a day. We're sort of we're groping for these sort of new urban typologies that allow us to actually, work in public and meet people in public to actually sort of extend the boundaries of space. And then, of course, there's all sorts of interesting, other sort of new urban interventions at other scales. This is my friend Theaster Gates. This is the Dorchester project in Chicago, where he took a number of residential houses on the south side and turned them into art spaces, libraries, all sorts of ways for community yoga, all sorts of community programs. And so I think, this is the whole question of, how do we do urban infill and how do we challenge this? And aiding that, I think, or what it can be is stuff like Airbnb. Airbnb is, I think, a really powerful site. Many people use it. I think Airbnb as a company has gone the wrong direction. They want to become a hotel company, right? And I know in New York, we're fighting huge legal battles against Airbnb because we're actually seeing them run a sort of illegal distributed hotel chain inside the city. But what Airbnb points to, I think, is this sort of notion of, this sort of network-enabled city where we can now sort of douse around us and look for empty spaces in all the buildings around us. And so we can use it to actually sort of find, these sort of hidden pockets of offices that will allow us to walk into environments that are incredibly diverse that we would never find otherwise, and also allow us to sort of experience serendipity. Airbnb is one. I think there's all sorts of other interesting network tools like this. Eat With is a really interesting one. It's sort of Airbnb, but for meals. The only difference is that unlike Airbnb, where in theory you should be staying at someone's home, but they're never around, Eat With is explicitly about dining with the family. It's about actually a sort of social serendipity experience where you are meeting with someone and you are sharing food with them and breaking bread. I'm not certain you can use that in a business dinner context, but to me it's sort of interesting about the sort of social tools that we're building. And all sort of coming together at increasingly interesting larger scales. So this is Tony Hsieh, who's the CEO of Zappos, which really is sort of taking what I'm talking about to its extreme. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Zappos is a $2 billion online retailer. It sells shoes, clothing, basic stuff. In 2004, he moved the company to Las Vegas from San Francisco to take advantage of cheaper call center labor. Basically, it's famous for its customer service. It does all of its logistics, through UPS in Kentucky. And so, he built a classic suburban headquarters there. Like Pixar, what they did is they closed all of the exits except one. So every employee would have to funnel out through one exit and see each other and talk. And they did all these things. And a year or two ago, or I guess it's a little bit longer now, Tony decided that that ultimately the suburban campus typology was going to reach its limits. He was worried that Zappos would not evolve. People think of Zappos as a technology company. It's not. It's actually a very low-skilled, low-educated call center company. And he was curious about how do we actually evolve it. And he was the one who discovered, reading the readings of Jeff West and Betancourt and what separates cities from companies. And so he set out to basically figure out how could he merge his company with the city of Las Vegas? How could he evolve the entire organization further and bring more ideas into it? And so what he did is he actually moved his headquarters into the former City Hall. This is the sort of inner ring at City Hall there. And then he took his $350 million he got from his payout from Amazon and set out to build what has been called the Downtown Project. He was basically going to build a creative class company town. That would be there to benefit Zappos employees. And so what he set to do is he invested in startups and local amenities, all these sorts of things to build a walkable downtown, to attract people from San Francisco and elsewhere, to actually build the sort of ecosystem of talented people that he could then hire or eventually make his employees smarter. And he also saw that downtown Las Vegas would become an extension of the company's headquarters itself. I mean, he explicitly sees all of the bars and restaurants downtown as extensions of the company's conference rooms. And I've actually seen it. I was out there in January meeting with one of his portfolio companies. It's called Shift. It's sort of a new, it's a car, bike, and ride-sharing startup all in one. And they had their final meeting of the day at 9 o'clock at night at a local bar, where Tony was also there taking meetings. This is partly a function of Zappos' strange culture, where it's sort of an overgrown college campus. But I still think it was interesting that they really saw the extension of the company into the community and allowed for all these sorts of interesting encounters. And so he spent some of his money to actually build a container park here, which is sort of theme parkish. But this sort of notion of building public amenities. The problem with the downtown project, ultimately, as you can imagine, is that it's not a real city. And recently they laid off 30% of the staff there because I think Tony realized that some of the projects they were chasing were complete dead ends, and because some of the metrics they were chasing were problematic. To me, the most interesting thing, if he can prove it, is that he actually wants to use sensors to actually figure out how many collisionable hours there are per person per day. So is there a metric of serendipitous collisions that we can then map onto the performance metrics of Zappos? This is the great question we'll get to in the final piece of this, but that's the one he's sort of groping towards. Can we actually see, if you and I meet someone on the street, can we build a new metric that can actually explain this? And that's the 40-foot praying mantis he bought from Burning Man, by the way, that actually does shoot fire out of the antenna. And so the fourth step of this is the network. Can we map social networks onto space and time to actually prove this out? If I'm in the city, can we use social networks to basically, A, maintain cohesiveness, so I'm still part of the organization I nominally work for and we're communicating over the cloud while I'm meeting all these other people, and then B, can we identify new possibilities? Can we engineer serendipity at a social level? And the answer to that, I think, unequivocally yes. So this is a network map. This is produced by a Chicago sociologist named Ronald Burt. Burt is famous for the concept of structural holes. And it was his whole argument that in any social network, more than 3 people or 4 people, there become gaps in the various cliques. And so you can see it here. This is a map that he made by hand for a very large pharmaceutical corporation, not GSK, I assume, but he wouldn't tell me who it was. I don't know if I have a laser pointer here, but yes. So you can sort of see where the structural holes are, right? Here's a huge group. This is both geographic and organizational. Here's a whole other cluster. I think this is on a different continent. And as you can see, there's a handful of people here who bridge these structural holes. And the various colors mean this. So this company, they took the inner circle to the CEO, and then they also had a training program for the next generation of leaders who were also in this. So the senior executive team was in orange. The program participant were the people who were being groomed for leadership. And the people in white, they just happened to be in the network map. To me, this is really interesting because the 2 most pivotal people in this whole organization are 96, this node here, and 818, this node here. And they are not senior people who are being fast-tracked for leadership. There's an entire informal, hidden structure to the company that the formal hierarchy could not grasp. And as soon as Burt presented this handmade social network, which he built from interviews with participants, they quickly rushed those 2 people into the leadership program. So you can see here, we don't really understand our own organizations. It's there's a hidden structure that we're failing to map. Once again, there's an illegibility to companies that is there, and then we can map it out, but only if we really try. And this is done by hand. The question becomes, can we do this in real time? And if we can do it in real time, can we then actually redesign space to actually fit the actual org chart? And which comes back to all sorts of interesting implications for office design, more iterative design. And then there's all sorts of stuff we can get offline. So I'm sure, how many of you are on Tinder? Anybody? Come on, let's see hands. You're all lying. Somebody on here is on Tinder, I know it. Well, this is Scruff. Scruff and Grindr preceded Tinder. So Tinder got all of its best ideas from actually the gay dating sites. Grindr is really interesting. Scruff, a friend of mine, uses as well. So it's interesting. I mean, Grindr was actually a breakthrough. Tinder is simply a copycat of what Grindr did, because Grindr did something actually truly groundbreaking in the sense of it made totally invisible information quite legible. I mean, walking down the street without a whole, of course, elaborate set of codes that have developed over years, you could not really tell if a man's homosexual unless you know what to look for, if you had very good gaydar. Well, what Grindr and Scruff did was basically take that gaydar and then build it into an app form, where now you simply hold out your phone and you know who's around you and you can message that. Tinder, of course, has adopted it. But I think Scruff is interesting. So I went out in the East Village. I went crawling through gay bars in the East Village recently with a friend of mine. It sounds better than it does. It's better than it sounds, trust me. And what was interesting to him, what was interesting to me is that my friend Jeff, who also studies cities, is that he was using Scruff as essentially a dowsing rod to see who was at its local bars. He was using it as a way to navigate the city around him. And you could actually watch the whole screen change as various people pass in and out of his network on a block-by-block basis. The hidden network neighborhoods were becoming legible through Scruff, and he could actually figure out, by partially through experience, because it doesn't show exactly where they are, but figuring out who is those local haunts. And this is exactly the sort of things that are becoming available. So the social networks are becoming legible to us in space and time. And of course, here's Tinder, which is drifting away from proximity. I think they're being seduced by the money, and now they're offering pro features that will allow you to search, miles and miles away. But I also think it's interesting that Tinder, as part of their whole plan, is they actually want to do Tinder for business, which is what a lot of startups like Coffee and Weave and some others are doing to apply the sort of Tinder approach to basically business dating. And what to me is more interesting, there's also stuff like Hinge. This is a new dating app which sort of explicitly takes structural holes and ties it together. You're being introduced to friends of your friends on Facebook and other social media. It's basically doing a very basic social network analysis, figuring out commonalities, and then offering you potentialities out of your friends. And so, it's more than just, who happens to be around me and do I like their photo or not. This is the one that's mining data exhaust and figuring out, this is a gap that needs to be plugged in your social networks. And various people have tried to do this in other contexts, right? There's a whole generation of apps called Highlight and Sonar. This is Social Radar that are basically trying to take that model of here's who's around you, here's what you have in common, you guys, maybe you should talk. I mean, it doesn't explicitly try to introduce you, except on some level. The problem is the things you have in common are the lowest common denominator stuff dug out of your Facebook profiles. Wow, we have TED in common. That's great. You like TED Talks? I love TED Talks. I've never really used it. I'm dying to use one of these apps, and it hasn't happened yet. And I think that's partly a function because we don't have enough context about the people around us. But that is going to change. That is going to change very shortly, I think. So this is a company I wrote about in March called Relationship Science. This is a hand-built social network of 3 million people, the 1% effectively. It was built by 800 people in India, sourced from tens of thousands of public databases, and bound together in this beautiful interface that shows you how you're connected. So if you want to get to Stephen A. Schwartzman, who runs BlackRock, you map it against your own personal connections. You can enter in through LinkedIn, and then it shows you routes through its entire social network. Red shows that it's actually you have a high connection there. Orange shows it's moderate. Yellow is weak. And if you were to mouse over it, you could see there it would show you the exact paths through previous employers you worked with, through universities you attended, through donations you made, through stock holdings, through board memberships. All of these sort of publicly known pathways, but all of which are too buried under too much SEC stuff for you to ever find. So what it does is simply takes it takes unknown knowns and makes them known knowns in the sense of suddenly you understand the social connections that bind you to Stephen A. Schwartzman. Or don't. When it works, it's like magic, and when it doesn't, you're sort of like, I sort of know that person, but not really. There's still a level of illegibility you can't get past. But people are trying to do this more and more, and now we're seeing tools are starting to trickle down. This is a startup called Rexter. What it does is it reads your email, basically reads your Gmail, your calendars, your meetings. It goes through all of your sort of social stuff, and then quietly builds a profile about you. And then it uses that to actually produce a score. And it takes that, it produces a score of how important this person is to you, and then also maps it against your real corporate performance metrics. So the whole point of the app is when you walk into the office each day and you're trying to figure out where you should start on your to-do list, Rexter is designed to tell you, call this person first. This person is the one who generates the most value for you, so start here. And so it's building this sort of hidden maps of your entire social network base and actually trying to help you actually create value out of it. And then we can take this further, right? That's just off building whatever you have in the cloud. My friend Ben Weber has designed a sensor, this is called Sociometric Solutions, where it's essentially a badge about the size of an iPhone that you would wear on your neck. And it includes microphones, infrared, Bluetooth, accelerometers. And what it does is it actually listens to your conversations and follows you where you go. So it doesn't record what you're saying, which would be scary. What it does is actually much scarier in a way. It records how you say it. It listens to your speaking patterns. Are you taking turns talking? Who's doing the talking around the table? In what sequence? Are you dominating the conversation? Are you hanging back? Who else is in the room with you, which you can identify through Bluetooth and infrared? And actually starts building those social network maps and figures out exactly how you're spending your time. And then it follows you with the accelerometer back to where you go after said meeting. And so what you can do is, in this case, here's a brief experiment. He worked with a retail bank branch. These are all Ben's slides. So it actually built a social network of 3 different bank branches here, and then mapped those performances against their real-world metrics. So of these 3, based on their social network structures, which of these 3 branches do you think was doing the best according to its official performance metrics? Can I show of hands? Can we see numbers? Who thinks number 1 was the best? Who thinks number 2 was the best? Who thinks number 3 was the best? It's interesting because the vast majority of you are wrong. Number 1 is the best. It had the right level of cohesion between everyone in the group, and it bridged all the major structural holes. There was an actual high degree of cohesiveness, but not too cohesive. Branch number 3 was the second best. There was a very high level of cohesion in the core, but some people were completely marginalized, as you can see. Their contributions were essentially shut out. So they did well, but not well enough. They did not actually realize everyone's potential. And branch number 2 was, of course, a basket case. And does anyone know why it looks like its brain's been split in 2? Yes, they were separate. They were on separate floors. That was the entire reason. 2 social networks cleaved in 2 because of that staircase. And so yeah, so Ben was basically able, as a consultant, to step in and say, this is why your performance is suffering, because you have such terrible communication patterns because of that break in floors. And so, you know, we're reaching this point. There's another group I'm meeting with, actually, when I fly back tonight. I'm meeting with a group called People Science, not related to relationship science. They really need to work on their naming conventions. But they're doing something similar. They're actually developing a whole set of tools and methodologies, design and cultural, to do the same sort of social network maps. This is one of theirs showing, I think this is United Health Group, showing various units, sales, marketing, and a third group, maybe HR. This is, of course, an analysis before they intervened. Then they realized where the gaps were. They stepped in, built a whole program to connect them all, and then this is the result afterwards, where they had a much higher degree of cohesiveness, which then they are now mapping against their performance metrics. And while I haven't seen the final results, they think it's quite promising. So, you know, this goes back to the whole notion of, you know, they're actually, you know, we can intervene in space and time. We can build sort of new patterns if we can identify the real social networks and figure out who to intervene with. And so when I'm talking about engineering serendipity, I mean, I think this is the greatest example of that, where literally we can finally start to understand how people are using space, using it informally, not formally. And then once we do that, we can step in and actually start changing the space to do that. And I think this is something that co-working, for example, does really well, and where I really caught on to this notion. The community manager that exists in co-working spaces, where there's someone who has an eyes on the floor and is always watching the interflow of people, it doesn't seem to be something that exists in offices, right? That's not what HR does, and it's not what facilities management does. I think there needs to be a revolution, actually, in both of those areas, where the HR person now becomes a sort of social network manager, someone who becomes a sort of air traffic controller in the sky, who can identify these structural holes as they start to form, and actually introduce people to each other, or, you know, do some sort of mediated plugging of that hole. And the same thing with facilities management, right? I mean, facilities management is typically stuck in the whole, like, you know, cost per square foot paradigm, where your job is to reduce the number of square footage. Well, if we can start using data like this, and we start to understand the possibilities of serendipity, we can start to manage space for value, and it become the role of facilities management to start figuring out how we can iteratively design space and start, you know, making the space conform to how we work versus the traditional method of conforming ourselves to our workspaces. So, you know, this is the sort of graphic the New York Times came up with at the end, this notion that we're going to be propelling people together through the combination of networks and interventions. So I think that's where I'm at, but thank you so much, and please, I hope you have questions.